Welcome friends, acquaintances and even strangers. Good morning, afternoon and evening. Today is Friday. Now, to some, Friday is the start of the weekend. I'm not gonna go into this debate at the moment. Instead, we can look for today, we can take a look about Mythic Plus. Because we are starting a new season of Mythic Plus, so we are starting to see perhaps some changes in the meta, some shakeups in the compositions of your groups. So I wanted to just draw a picture of Season 3 as we start to get into Season 4, so that we can then use it as a comparison to see how many things in general are going to be changing in Season 4, and also to look back at our last, at the very least, let's just call it our last serious, our last full season of Shadowlands, since Season 4 is a little bit weird on that end. To see how many things will change, to compare them with the overall picture of Season 3. Sure, we have seen the balance tuning, very disappointingly, has not hit too many specs. We have gotten a minor nerf to survival, a more heavy nerf to destruction, which seemingly is not changing too much at the moment, and then some minor buffs here and there, AoE increase to Shadow Priest, some tankiness buff to both Protection Warrior and Protection Paladin, but the fear at the moment is that it is not going to impact too much of anything in Season 4. But for the moment, let's just go and take a look at the picture of Season 3 and how it ended and how it went throughout the whole season. I'm gonna take the help of Reddit user Dranit21312, which made a very good post on the competitive WoW subreddit, making up a series of graphs about the popularity, about the average Mythic Plus score of all specs and of all classes, etc, just to see how Season 3 overall has ended. So the first thing I wanted to take a look at was the population. Straight up, all of the players that got their rating according to Radar.io stats. We can see that the far and away winner is Hunter as a whole. This is not too surprising. We have talked at length whenever we go over these type of talks about how popular marksmanship and beast mastery are as specs overall. So imagine what happens in a season when you also add survival to the mix, survival being the strongest of the melee specs in the last season. So of course Hunter is far and away the most popular of DPS classes in general. Now for the least popular of the DPS, you have Priest as a single spec. Sure, Hunter in here is comprised of 3 different DPS specs, but let me tell you, all 3 specs are beating Shadow Priest anyways. So Shadow makes it to the bottom of the ranking. Not really too surprising, to be honest. Shadow Priest has never been too much of a popular spec, especially because it's never been too much into the meta anyways, especially in Mythic Plus, so it makes sense that they are not that popular overall. Some of the surprising names popping up in here perhaps is the quite low popularity of Monk as a DPS, because of, if you look at the power of Windwalker last season, Windwalker was basically the second best melee DPS spec, just below survival, and yet it is still beaten by some other DPS specs, like Demon Hunter, for example, one of the classic popular specs, very similar to Hunters. They are still very popular, regardless of their state in the meta, essentially. So that was quite interesting. What is a little bit less interesting is the popularity of healers, because we do see here that Shaman and both of the priest specs together, although 95% of that number is Holy Priest, are the 2 most popular specs. The least popular, less surprisingly so, is Mistweaver Monk, right at the bottom, almost the least popular of all specs, because Mistweaver, is not quite the chosen spec recently, and for recently I mean ever since they came out after the first couple of tiers where they got nerfed in Mists. They have never quite gotten back to that level pretty much, and they have not been that played. Just as a disclaimer, technically Discipline Priest would be the least played spec overall, not Mistweaver, because Discipline Priest here gets carried by Holy Priest. One of the powers of having a role with a multi-spec option in the same class like Priest is that you can jump in and out of the specs depending on which one is best for what. Mistweaver does not have that luxury. When you look at tanks, there is no jumping in between specs here. Tanks are only 1 per class, so the most popular tank in here Unsurprisingly, you might be surprised unless you have watched my videos about Mythic Plus, the most popular tank is Paladin. And this is also by quite a significant margin compared to all other tanks. That's because Prot Paladin is the most popular tank at all key levels. It has been the most popular tank for the longest time, even though the meta has been dominated by Death Knight. Still, the most amount of tanks are Paladin. This is not too much of a surprise. What is also not too much of a surprise is the lowest of the popular tanks being Warrior. Protection Warrior has not lived too much of a happy expansion compared to the feasts, compared to the glory days of BFA. Prot has gone quite downhill in this expansion. It's good that the Dragonflight talents seem to be quite great for protection, so perhaps there is going to be a resurrection, a resurgence of Protection Warrior in Dragonflight, but not at the moment. Now, perhaps something of a more interesting graph to go over is the amount of players who got Keystone Master, the amount of players who got above 3000 rating in your Mythic Plus rating, because of course, to some degree, this is going to reflect the popularity of the classes, right? Hey, look, Hunter and Warlock are still at the top, and Monk, Healer, Priest, DPS, and Warrior Tank are all at the bottom, just like the popularity, right? It seems to reflect that way. But you can already see some changes. For example, Warlock is much closer to Hunter in the gap that the two classes have compared to the popularity of Specs, which means way more Warlock are being played to get past 3000 rating, so way more Warlocks are played to get to high rating keys compared to Hunters, which is expected, right? Because many players still play Beast Mastery, even though Beast Mastery is not that popular in high keys, etc, etc, so it does make sense. You also have Priest Healer, which goes up a couple of rankings from its popularity. There are more overall Priest Healers getting high ratings, a high score compared to their popularity. Same goes for Shaman. Shaman being 5th in the popularity, but 3rd in the amount of Shamans getting past 3000 rating. This is because, well, maths have told me that Mythic Plus groups are played with 3 DPS and with just 1 healer, so the two most popular healers, Shaman and Priest, are bound to have way more chances to get to 3000 plus rating because they have to heal the group of 3 DPS, so they're gonna have more room to be going into high keys compared to the DPS, who have to fight much more against each other. Lastly, to give you a very good idea of just how popular certain specs were at the very high level, is the graph displaying the score, the Mythic Plus score needed to be top 100, a top 100 player of your spec or of your class. For example, if you want to take the absolute opposites, if you want to be a top 100 Warlock player, you have to be very likely a Destro Warlock, and you have to have at least 3838 rating. Meanwhile, if you wanted to be a top 100 Mistweaver Monk player, all you had to do is get 3274. That is a difference of basically 600 rating. That's the difference between clearing 30 keys, plus 30 keys, and clearing plus 20 keys. That's how much of a gap these two specs, these two classes have at the moment. You can see some very other obvious differences. For example, Death Knight Tank now has skyrocketed to the top, as opposed to Paladin Tank, which has now gotten much lower. So it's much easier to get into the top 100 of Paladin tanks compared to DK tanks, because of course there are so many DK tanks in the highest level of keys that there is a very fierce competition. Same goes for Priest Healer, and for Shaman Healer the difference is just about 40 rating between the two. Meanwhile, other healer specs, even Paladin and Druid, not necessarily just Mistweaver, even those two healers need to have some 300, 200 less rating than Priest and Shaman to make it into the top 100. So I find it a quite good characterization of just how popular certain specs were at the top level, at the max level, compared to others. We can then finish our set of graphs with the comparison between the population and the accessibility. In this case, accessibility means the percentage of the population to get to 3000 rating. So the more players who play a certain class or spec get to 3000 rating, the higher their accessibility. So in this example, you see Warlock, Hunter and Shaman Healer being very high in accessibility, meaning that 10 to 12% of Shaman, Warlock and Hunter players get to 3k rating. Meanwhile, Monk players or Warrior players, only 2%. Only 2% of all players playing those specs get to 3k rating or higher. This is perhaps more indicative of how many players effectively try to be competitive in their spec or in their class. It is likely very possible that players playing those specs are not very competitive because they don't really care about playing the flavor of the month spec or the strongest spec, which also means they are not very into climbing to very high keys. You know, Red Paladin having a 1.80% chance of being above 3k rating. Can a Red Paladin do plus 20 keys? Of course it can. It's very possible. It's very easy for a Red Paladin to complete plus 20 keys, yet there is very, very few Red Paladins who got to that rating level. So I found this also as well to be a quite telling story in the type of players who choose to play each and every different spec and class in Season 3. Now that we looked back at Season 3, let's also finish by looking at the higher levels of keys of Season 3, just to compare them to the higher level as soon as we start getting some more serious keys in Season 4, to see how many things will change in the upper echelon of competitiveness of Season 4 in Mythic Plus. In Season 3 we ended with the dominance of Blood Death Knight when it comes to high keys for tanks. We can see 42% of Blood Death Knights were present in keys at plus 25 level or higher, with the second best being still quite healthy, 20% representation of Brewmaster Monks. It means that you have a Brewmaster Monk in 1 every 5 keys, which is okay for the spec. When it comes to healers, unfortunately, no, Holy Priest did not make the cut and beat Shaman even at keys higher than 25, yet they were quite clearly mostly just the two taken specs at that level of keys, basically 80%. Only 1 out of 5 keys at the level 25 or higher did not have either a Holy Priest or a Restore Shaman. This is telling, and once again I'm pretty happy to show that I was right. Now in Season 4, even though it's just a few days, in the higher level of keys, in the plus 20 and higher range, Holy Priest has taken that mantle from Restore Shaman. Most of the other healer specs, as you can see, are not changing too much. It's not that other specs have taken over. There just seems to have been a slight swap, a switcheroo between Holy Priest and Restore Shaman. For melee DPS, we have of course Survival dominating to almost 40% of representation. This one is even more powerful than the 42% of Blood Death Knight, because Blood Death Knight has to compete with 5 other specs, while Survival was competing with 12 other specs, and they still made it that high. So that was to show the dominance of Survival. At the moment, the situation seems to be still in favor of Survival in Season 4, but the predicted growth of Outlaw is definitely there, and the continued good level of Windwalker is also there in Season 4. So if anything, if you want to be slightly optimistic, at the very least the outlook of melee DPS in Season 4 is just slightly better. It's not that Survival is bad, but at the very least a couple of other specs are seeing more play at the moment in the high level of keys. We can then finish with range DPS. We have seen this abomination multiple times by this point, which was the 50+% of Destruction Warlock. Destruction has received way more of a hefty nerf compared to Survival, so you could expect bigger changes in that department in Season 4. At the start, in just a few days of Season 4, the situation is still quite dominant in favor of Destruction. They are still easily, far and away, the most popular of specs at the moment. Fire Mage, however, as predicted, seems to have risen much more than previously. Previously, Fire Mage was even having to contend with Frost Mage and Demonology Warlock, but now they seem to be much more wanted and used in the very high level of keys. So this is a situation at the moment in Season 4. It's just been like 3 days of the season, so we are bound to see a much more clear divide in the meta of specs in the next few days. But for now, this was the recap of what happened in Season 3 and how things shaked up in Season 3 overall that I wanted to make, to have this sort of time capsule of Season 3 to compare in Season 4 for the following weeks of this season. So with this recap being done, we can now leave each other. We are done. There is nothing else to talk about for Mythic Plus. So first things first, of course, a round of applause to all of my Patreon supporters. Of course, thank you guys for supporting me. This is what makes the continuing production of these videos possible, as eventually we will get deeper into producing content. We will get into streaming, especially once we get into the beta and there is much more content to test and to try out for in Dragonflight before the release of the expansion. So it's nice to know that I have your support as I continue producing content for all of you. After thanking my dear patrons, you can also support me by liking and commenting down below on these videos. Perhaps for today, I would like to read your fondest memories about Season 3, your choices, whether or not your choice of your main spec left you satisfied in Season 3 of Mythic Plus, or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps what terrible decision, what terrible choice did you make in Season 3 that perhaps you had to rectify by re-rolling, or simply you ended up being stuck in that spec which made your Season 3 much less enjoyable. Also, you can of course subscribe to the channel as well, and for further parasocial relationship behavior, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right down at these links. With all of this talk done, now we can actually leave each other for real. Thank you guys again for watching the video and for supporting the channel. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, okay, fine, I will take it with this heat because it's supposedly only going to last a couple of days and then we are back to a somewhat human-like temperature. So, fine.